My name is Marie-Claire Brisbois, and I'm an Associate Professor of Energy Policy in the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex. And I research mostly on energy and climate governance and transitions. And my work looks at issues of power and politics. So where's the decision-making power? Where's the money? And how does that shape trying to work towards a cleaner, more sustainable, more equitable world? The main thing is that I get really angry when things are not just. So I get really emotionally upset by injustice, but that ends up being the basis for a lot of what I do, because that extends to then looking at problems systemically. So trying to take a look at, okay, we have these issues around justice, around global inequality, around climate, around energy systems. And what are the root causes? So what's behind all this, and what are the systems that are driving things that are unsustainable? And so sort of following that thread through, I can end up looking at lots of different things, lots of different research topics where you see unsustainable systems manifesting, and then being able to focus in on, okay, how can we diagnose the problem, what dynamics are going on here, and what could we possibly do to address it? The short answer is my students. I mean, I've done lots of work that I think is interesting and important, that's contributed to other things. But I think if you look at the place, almost for any university academic, the place where you really make the broadest impact, unless you do something unique and outstanding, is that you shift how people think, that you get people to think critically about things that maybe they weren't thinking critically about. And then also been lucky enough to teach really a wide range of students who go on to do incredible things, and they often came in as incredible people, but yeah, hopefully they leave with a few more tools to go out and keep doing things that are helpful and keep building the network of people who sort of are clued up with the deeper dynamics that are going on in the world, and can then act accordingly. One key moment was not actually a moment. It was more a process, and that's when I started my PhD. My PhD supervisor, Rob Delow at the University of Waterloo, was really strong on conceptual development. And so as part of the PhD process, he made me read things that I wouldn't have otherwise read. And so he made me really deeply read up on institutions, on sort of the theory of governance, on participation, but it was not superficial at all. It was really deeply reading and understanding these core concepts, where the ideas come from, the academic traditions, and it's still knowledge that benefits me to this day, because I'm able to draw on that deeper theoretical understanding and understand where fields are going to, sort of trajectories, also when we're reinventing the wheel, which happens quite a lot, but to do some short circuiting of that, to say, oh, actually, we've already talked about these dynamics in the 90s, and we can build on that. And so hopefully that's helpful in sort of building a strong foundation for research moving forward. Another key motivating moment was, a process and not just a single moment, but I finished my master's in 2007, and it was in biological engineering, and I did a master's on stream ecosystem health, definitely not energy geography. It was water. And I was out in streams, and I was sampling things. And after that, I knew there were things about the world that I was missing, but I didn't know what I didn't know. I just knew I didn't know things. And so after that, I spent a year living and working in rural Guatemala, and it was an incredible opportunity. It was incredibly difficult. It's something I'm really glad I did, and I don't want to have to do again, because it really like realigned the entire way I think about how the world works, about knowledge systems, about ontologies, about yeah, the role of different countries and different institutions in the world. And it was profoundly disruptive. But ultimately, I would never give it back, because it made me realize that the world is not positivist. It's a much more complicated place than I thought it was. There are no simple solutions, and you can't solve any problem in isolation. So we couldn't just deliver clean water without addressing colonial legacies, inequality, global economic systems that mean that some people in some parts of the world live in abject poverty, um, and where other people have a lot of privilege, and that's often not an accident. There were historical events orchestrated to keep certain communities in poverty or prevent democracies from developing, because they would threaten profits for some companies. So really just yeah, learning that the world is quite ugly in lots of ways, quite beautiful in lots of other ways. And so that really shifted the trajectory of my life, and meant that when I did go back and do a PhD after having worked in environmental advocacy and as a government consultant, that I went back and did a PhD on these fundamental questions of power in energy systems, because it's the politics of energy that drive a lot of the geopolitics and these wider dynamics that we see playing out around the globe. I mean, I think there are still just basic issues of inequality in or gender inequality, lots of inequalities, but also gender inequality in the energy space. And I think uh, it's we have been making progress. Um, Energy is often a very male-dominated space. Historically, that has been the case, and it's been quite scary actually recently um, to see essentially rollbacks in freedoms or in support for diversity, equity, and inclusion coming from the US, because they really have made it possible for women to participate in these conversations, to be active participants in energy research and energy governance. But it's still not, it's still not equal. I was at something the other day where there was an all-male panel, and it was quite striking, which was great, that like certainly it was easy to notice it was an all-male panel, but uh, but yeah, I mean, it still happens. It still happens. So I think that is still there. And it's sort of the higher up you go, the worse it gets. In academia, we've done a really good job of breaking down a lot of these barriers. It's still there though, and you run into it in surprising places, in sort of subtle comments and in just sort of certainly not intentional things, but just unconscious bias. So there's definitely more work to do, but it's quite frustrating at the same time. One of the best ways to go about accelerating progress is to support other women or sort of other diverse populations. And the reason I'm saying this is because in early attempts at sort of more gender inclusion, there were more women being hired, but the way that you would succeed as a woman would be essentially as acting like you were male. So really buying into these sort of top-down. This is not to put people in boxes. There are certainly men who don't operate according to these sort of management styles. But also just, I mean, I suppose just to operate in stereotypes. Um, but really to succeed sort of in the 80s or the 90s, you had to, yeah, assume these competitive attitudes that really put you in direct competition with other women who were trying to succeed. And so it was really not that uncommon to have to push other people down to climb higher. And that has slowly been changing, and there's been huge amounts of progress, and networks of women working together to build each other up and to work collaboratively. So it really is best when we work together. It's really horrible to have to actively compete against other women, or really to actively compete at all. It can be quite unpleasant. But there's lots of emerging examples for doing things better. And one really good example is the Energy Demand Research Center, which is a research center that I'm part of. It's headed by two women, Mari Martiskainen and Sarah Walker, and they have been running it in a very different way. It's the entire proposal development process was extremely collaborative. So trying to minimize hierarchies and not impose top-down decisions, but really to source ideas from the bottom up, to give people voice and say, and to run it in a much more collective and collaborative way. And the trade-off is that it inevitably takes more time and it requires that you participate actively. But the flip side of that is that it avoids a lot of that sort of frustration with not having voice, feeling like you can't explore the things that you need to explore, and frustration with top-down management. And as a result, I think the center has been a really positive and supportive environment in which to work. And I think people are doing really great work in that environment. And it's really allowing space for collaboration with people outside of academia. So co-production or co-development of research ideas with people in industry or in government. It's allowing a lot of space for early career researchers to try to gain experience, to lead projects on their own, to lead papers. These things that can be really helpful for early career scholars, but can be really difficult because the systems and structures that are in place aren't designed to allow people without a certain level of job security or seniority to participate. So it's been really helpful to see that, and also to see just sort of an embodiment of better work-life balance, an embodiment of taking care of well-being, an encouragement to take holidays, and a respect when you do that. Yeah, I've just found it a very different environment. And some of that might be specific to the kinds of people that Mari and Sarah are. But I think it's also just an example of sort of a more collaborative and collective model than we've seen in sort of these male-dominated hierarchical structures. I mean, there's some easy stuff. And again, we've made progress on this, but it's always been interesting to go through and look at reading lists for the courses or classes or modules that you're assigning, because even still, when I go through, I find that I'm recommending people who are mostly male and are mostly from the global north. And it's a problem because because I want to be recommending work from all sorts of people. And I think there's two things at play here. One is implicit bias on my part, which you continuously have to work to address and do things like check your reading lists and be like, okay, am I practicing what I preach? And like, oh, I'm definitely not. I need to change this. But the other thing is that I think men, there is something where there's a confidence thing where a lot of men will be like, yes, I'm going to write this theory paper. Yes, I'm going to write this big review paper. And those become sort of the core pieces that everybody cites. And so I think there is space for women just to say yes to things, to be confident, and to do some of that foundational work. And there are amazing women who are doing that work, but it is like, why not you? Why not write that? And there's lots of data out there on how women are less likely, they're more successful at promotion applications, but they're less likely to go to apply for promotion until later on because they feel like they're not ready, even though they might have been ready several years earlier. So there is this thing where like a need to prove yourself to a certain level. But I mean, the worst that happens is you try to write a theory paper or some sort of foundational paper and you get kicked back and it's rejected and you just roll it into something else. So yeah, it's sort of a responsibility both on the part of people who are in a position where they can recommend that people read other things. And also for all of us in just being a bit braver in doing the big stuff and thinking the big thoughts and putting it all out there. Every once in a while, you do a research project or you run into a theory and it completely reorganizes your understanding of how decisions get made, how the world works. And we recently did a project, this like really collaborative, really interesting project with a dream team of people from Sussex and Leeds and Strathclyde, and looking at relational economics or relational sociology. And it's basically the core argument that people are not rational economic decision makers, but instead we make decisions based on social relationships and our relations with others. And this extends to the ways we use money, whether it comes from like an inheritance or from a salary is different. The decisions we make about our homes and our lives are more often about like, will this make someone I love comfortable or will this help them? And much less about like, well, what is the economic cost and is this a responsible economic decision? And so as part of that, there are actually two sort of core papers. One is a theory paper led by Mark Davis on, it's called Towards a Relational Sociology of Retrofit, because it was about energy retrofit. But the core ideas, I think, are really useful and can be applied to other areas. So the other paper that I'd really like to recommend is the flip side of the theory paper, and it's a methods paper, and it was led by Lucy Middlemiss from Leeds. And it's called, sorry, I'm reading it, so I'm looking to the side, Developing a Relational Approach to Energy Demand, a Methodological and Conceptual Guide. But it's about methods for exploring relational approaches to retrofit. And I think both of those were really, for me, it's really shifted how I think about how we can approach sort of sticky public policy challenges in the future in ways that I think are probably quite inherently feminist, and which appreciates sort of the messiness of human life in ways that a lot of dominant models don't. Just on the University of Sussex website, because all my projects and papers are there under my profile, well, some of it is also under the Energy Demand Research Centre website as well.